host webinars to encourage the conversation on water around the world, and not least through the lenses of human rights, gender equality, and youth empowerment. In this Water Dialogue series, we tap into the rich knowledge of the Stockholm Water Prize laureates and some of the exceptional youth that has been competing in the global final of the Stockholm Junior Water Prize. The dialogues focus on the curiosity and lust for knowledge that drives water-related science and education for young and old or older. Today, the specific focus is just that, the role of education and how education can empower us. We are deeply honored to have two experts on the topic with us today. Sandra Postel, who is a leading expert on international water issues. She's the founder of Global Water Policy Project and the co-creator of the Water Stewardship Initiative, Change the Course. As an author and educator, she has made important contributions to the understanding of some of the greatest challenges of our time, and has shown that we have the power to find sustainable solutions. Pontso Moletsane was awarded Stockholm Junior Water Prize for developing a revolutionary system to cut water usage in small-scale irrigation. And together with Motabele Moshodi and Sechaba Ramabenyane, he represented South Africa in 2005. Pontso, also known as Mr. P, is also a water and SDG advocate on social media and a friend of the Water Research Commission of South Africa. He is now referred to as a solutionist and a founder of a clean tech company called Yellow Beast. A warm welcome to both of you. We also encourage questions from the audience through the Q&A box below, and they will be given to our experts towards the end of the seminar. But I will now be handing over the facilitation of the dialogue to my communications colleague and youth empowerment focal point at CV, Georgette Keane. Georgette, please, over to you.
Thank you, Elin. As Elin mentioned, we really do want this to be a conversation. So if you have any thoughts or questions for our speakers, please don't hesitate to write them into the question and answer function, or if you're watching via Facebook, write your questions into the comments and we'll do our best to include them. Now, I'm not exaggerating when I say I'm honored to be joined by two water heroes today. Sandra and Pontso have advocated, innovated, communicated, and educated on water for many, many years. As Elin said, Sandra was named this year's Stockholm Water Prize laureate in recognition of a vital career which shows no signs of slowing down. And Pontso won the Stockholm Junior Water Prize in 2005 with two of his peers for their invention focused on irrigation. My name is Georgette, and I work at Stockholm International Water Institute. And as the person here with fewest prizes, none so far, I will leave most of the talking to Sandra and Pontso. So, Sandra, you have said that you always knew you wanted to work with the earth, namely protecting it. At what point did you feel I can make a difference?
Wow, that's a great question, Georgette. You know, I think I had a belief that if one has a passion for something, one can always make a difference. And making a difference, you know, takes many forms. And I think I was one of those very fortunate people, you know, to find a niche that I felt like I could occupy early in my life. You know, I mean, it doesn't always happen early, and I think it's important for us to always keep looking for what that niche is. You know, but I knew, as you said, from an early age that doing something on behalf of the earth was what I wanted to do with my life. And then water kind of found me as my niche, you know, and that I think was opportunity. You know, after graduate school, my first job was with a small company that was working on US water policy issues, groundwater and water conservation. And I just really loved it. And then just a couple of years into that, what really opened up was I was hired at a international, at a research institute that allowed me to focus on the global water picture. And I was still very young, I was still in my mid-20s. And so very much influenced by, the opportunity to think broadly about things. And so I think that sense of purpose and, finding my niche in global water happened, fortuitously for me at a young age. And I just stuck with it. It always felt like a place to contribute, because there was so much to do. So
amazing. And I think that's very inspiring what you're saying about finding a niche and to keep looking for it. Like you say, passion makes all the difference. So one of your first books was about irrigation, amongst other things. And I was wondering, once you'd found water, which is a niche, but also incredibly broad, how did you then find this next niche, which was, amongst other things, irrigation? What was it that was so engaging in just that for you?
Well, one of the things we learn right away is that it just takes a lot of water to grow crops. And so it's just crops are thirsty, and because we have to grow crops where there's sunshine, there's often not sufficient rainfall to grow the crops that we need. And so we have this mismatch, that we need sunshine, which means we don't always have the water there. So irrigation was important from the very beginning of human civilization. When you look at the Nile River Basin, you look at the Yellow River Basin, the major civilizations grew up around rivers. And so it's always been important. And today, 70% of all the water we extract for human purposes is for agriculture. And so it seemed to me that looking at, this was my all of my books have addressed agriculture because it's always important. But in my second book, which is, my goodness, it's over 20 years now, I think, I did look at sort of the history and sustainability of irrigated agriculture. And 40% of our food comes from irrigated agriculture. And so looking at how we can do more production and get more nutritious food for every liter of water we extract from the environment was very important to sustainability and to food security and to natural systems. We can't just keep taking if water is finite and still have a healthy environment. So figuring that out in agriculture was very important. And I also learned that, small scale technologies that are geared toward the very poorest farmers had sort of been overlooked in the irrigation age. We had these big pumps and these big wells and these big systems that allowed, the medium to higher end farmers to grow food and to grow crops. But the dollar a day farmer, the $2 a day farmer was often overlooked, and so looking at access to irrigation water as an entry point for poor farmers to come out of poverty and to have household food security was also very important. And, my travels to Bangladesh and to India in the late 90s was very eye-opening to me about the potential, for access to irrigation water among the poorest farmers to really lift, people out of poverty. And then if I can just say one more thing,
of course.
I kind of learned, I shouldn't say learned, I focused later, and I would say too much later, on the importance of soil as a reservoir of water. We're sort of trained early in the water space to think about irrigation when we think about agriculture. But 60% of the food is produced without irrigation, and whether we're irrigating or not, managing the soil and the health of the soil is really critical to expanding that reservoir of water in the soil. And so thinking about, bringing soil back to health is a water management strategy. And we didn't really think about it that way 40 years ago or 30 years ago. Mm. And so looking at regenerative ranching, regenerative farming, even if no irrigation is involved, is a water management strategy that I think going forward, especially with climate change bearing down, is going to be more and more important.
Yeah, because I actually was thinking as you were speaking, I wonder what you've identified as having changed, or like what do we know now that we didn't know then? So would you say this with the soil aspect of water management for agriculture is something you've seen, that you've noticed has changed since you wrote your book?
I think there's a lot more attention to that now. And I have to give credit to one of your colleagues, Malin Falkenmark, who, helped us think about blue water and green water. And by green water, it's that water in the soil. It's the water that plants are using, forests and grasslands and croplands. And managing that as one system is very important. So we knew about it thanks to researchers and scientists like Malin Falkenmark and others, but we hadn't really started to incorporate that, I think, in the way we're starting to now. And again, I think that's going to be very important for resilience to drought, resilience to flood, and dealing with our water quality challenges as a result of pollution coming off of farmland. So regenerative agriculture, I think, can solve many problems at the same time. So that's really important. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and that's also obviously using the nature that we have, like you say, that's maybe more accessible than these larger scale technologies, which is the perfect moment for me to introduce Pontso, who is joining us as well, as I mentioned, and as Elin mentioned, that he was winning the 2005 Stockholm Junior Water Prize just exactly for an innovation that addressed issues of water use in irrigation. Pontso, can you hear me?
Hear me? I can hear you. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible. It
Hello?
might be worth just switching off your camera just so we get the good sound quality. Thank you.
Okay, let me try that. You
So,
have to apologize that I was in between some errands and I had to see my physician. But and I also thought, well, I'm starting a bit an hour later because of the daylight savings. The hour shifted earlier. But nonetheless, I'm just glad I could make it. So yeah.
yes, thank you so much for joining us. And it's I think everyone finds it confusing with daylight saving, so that's not a problem. I was wondering, as I mentioned, your project in 2005 addressed issues with irrigation and water use in irrigation. How did you become aware of this issue at such a young age?
So for us, it was more a thing of you'd be coming from school and then you do your homework. And then as soon as your parents retire from work after the end of the day, they want to keep their lawn green, so they put water on it. And sometimes they're too tired because work is exhausting. I mean, they're only human. And as they have the hose on, water will start filling up the rest of the grassy area. And once it's filled up, it starts trickling down the road. And we figured back then as kids that this is kind of wasteful, isn't it? So we then saw an opportunity for the South African Youth Water Prize, enter that idea there. It happened to win there, and then it eventually made its way to Stockholm Junior Water Prize. And then to our surprise, it won there as well. But it was just from the observation that, look, in as much as we want to enjoy the things we want to enjoy because we're human, sometimes when we put natural resources on them, even our own humanity gets in the way and ends up wasting the same resources that we ought to conserve. So we just did that back then as kids and took a shot, and then now we're here.
Yeah, and it's really interesting what you say about our individual needs or interests can sometimes come at the cost of natural resources, and I think that's an awareness that you, Sandra, have also worked a lot to raise. Pontso, what I find so amazing is that of course you noticed the problem, but when did you realize maybe we have a solution? Like, was it one of your friends? Was it a teacher? How did you get inspired to look for a solution and not just see the problem?
The first question we started asking ourselves was, is it possible to have the technology that we rely on to be made or to be found that such that when you use it, it eliminates this dependency on our own abilities, because when they fall short, then we get this overuse or wastage. So we started asking that question, and then we had to do a bit of research. We had to try several ideas out, and eventually we landed on this one, like, where we could think, couldn't we develop something that's self-thinking and self-governing? Back then we didn't think about it in these terms, but the idea was geared towards this direction of something that's autonomous or self-thinking and self-regulating, and it then it's a valve system switch that operates of its own accord based on the conditions in the environment where it's working. So we ended up developing a very primitive demo of that to illustrate the idea, and then that's what was entered into these several competitions that eventually got the project to where it is now.
Amazing. And I think that just goes to show a simple idea nurtured can turn into something that can produce crops and save water and ultimately save lives. So I think that's really amazing to hear how simple the idea was to start with. And you've continued to work with agriculture, and Sandra also mentioned how agriculture and in part irrigation has been present throughout her work. What do you, Pontso, feel is so important about agriculture and irrigation that you want to keep focusing on it?
So the important thing about agriculture that I think we need to be realistic about is that we all have bellies and we have to eat at some point. So that's not going away. And agriculture is pretty much the backbone of civilization. Every account in history of humans and their existence has had to do with the taming of wild plants and animals so that we can enjoy the benefit of consuming them. That being said, we can't shy away from the fact that our own nature requires that we depend on the planet for sustenance. Just that basic thing alone is a very powerful thing we need to always observe. And secondly, I think that it is important that, it is important that we always look for solutions that try and, or rather that attempt to reduce the amount of or optimize the amount on the usage of some of the resources that we depend on, because it is that thinking out the box that will eventually help humanity strike a balance that is necessary to sustainably produce items. And this is one of the things that I do in some of my work to create awareness about how much water it takes to, I guess this is something similar to my colleague Sandra there, where I make short videos about 30, 40 seconds long, where I just make the public aware. It takes this much water to make one avocado, for example. Everybody likes, a lot of people like avocado on their sandwich. And but no one really pays attention to how much it takes to produce just one. So when you shine the spotlight on that, we then connect with the fact that, okay, water's on the planet, it's in our bodies, it's in our brains, it comes from the sky. It also goes into the avocados we eat. Shouldn't I then think different about it? And that's one of the things that I seek to create awareness about, on top of the work of developing, commercializing technology that reduces overuse of resources where food is produced. So I think it is something that I'll keep doing for as long as I can, because it is that much important. There's nothing we can do to get away from it. We're just as much connected to everything on the planet as it is connected to us. So we have to strike a balance and even use the tools that we can develop and create to meet that need.
Yeah. Thank you, and very, very well put. I wonder, Sandra, if you have any reflections on what Pontso has been saying. I know you have been a strong advocate of trying to make people aware of the food that's, the water that's on our plate, the water that's on our backs, in our clothes. Do you recall a moment or an idea or an explanation where you felt like, now people are getting it, or this is how I'm going to get people to understand? How do we raise that awareness?
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the first things we did when I started working as the freshwater fellow for the National Geographic Society, one of the very first things we did was to build a calculator online, mostly addressing the American public. So we used the figures for this country, which is one of the higher consumer societies in terms of personal water footprints, to educate people about exactly this question. And so we built the calculator using a lot of the data from the Water Footprint Network, but also US focused data, so people could just walk through their life and answer questions about their diet and their energy use and their transportation, the kinds of shopping they did, and then their home water use. And then we gave tips along the way. So it was really National Geographic has such a wide reach. And so I thought this was really a terrific opportunity to educate a wide audience of all ages about this question. And sometimes when we would go out, to speak to different groups, to me, it was just so gratifying to speak with, an 8-year-old little girl or boy who was just astonished to learn, how much water it took to make their t-shirt, and you could just see the lights go off, and I always feel it's challenging. You don't want to make people feel guilty, right, about their life. But to me, education is empowerment. If you educate, then you have opportunities to make wiser choices. And I think that's what's starting to happen, is that people are realizing. When I was starting to work on water, nobody was talking about the water and climate impacts of our diet to speak of. That was just not something the public was conscious of. And I would say now that's most people are aware of, a very commercial meat intensive diet has a water impact, it has a climate impact, has an energy, of course, impact. And so that awareness has been really critical. And, when I think about the big water challenge that we're facing globally, it's really two things. Water's finite, and we can see in front of us, ecosystems are really hurting. Freshwater ecosystems, lakes, rivers, groundwater, wetlands. And so the two things we have to do is shrink that human water footprint. We cannot continue to have it grow because it's a finite water supply. So shrink that footprint and then return water to the natural world to make it healthy again. So that whole water footprint concept is key. And it's our personal consumption and how we produce things. So if we can produce our diets using less water. So if, whether we're a farmer, an irrigator, or producing something in a factory, whatever, if we can use less water to produce it and then consume less on the consumption side, we're going to shrink that footprint and be able to return some water to the natural world. And I think that's the big challenge in a nutshell, is those two things. And so it's really critical. And I think the optimistic thing is that people are starting to become much more aware and concerned and empowered to make a difference, in their own lives. So I think it's a good opportunity now. Yeah.
I like what Sandra's saying about we shouldn't, as let's say intellectuals or scientists or whomever knows a bit more about the workings of the things we interact with, it's probably best to avoid shaming people. And I think that's a very powerful thing to do, because no one wants to feel bad for doing something that makes them feel good. I mean, when you eat a sandwich or drink a can of cool drink, just to refresh, or whatever the case may be, or whatever it is that you may consume, just because it feels good to consume it, you don't want that coupled with a feeling of guilt or shame. That's a very and comfortable way to live and think about your existence as an individual. That being said, I think one of the things that I would like to assume that Sandra and I concur on is that information from organizations like the Water Footprint Network, etc., when packaged in a way that it's relatable and appeals to how we think and behave in today's world and will evolve as our culture changes, then it makes it easy for us to say, okay, you know what, perhaps there is something that teaches me about being mindful of my impact on the environment. Because if one understands that a nice t-shirt that they're wearing can take up to 2,700 liters of water, for example, then they might have a different approach to how long they wear it, as opposed to, you know, wearing it a few times and then throwing it away. Or they could incorporate it in a circular fashion where they could give it up to someone who needs it, or, you know, upscale it and then sell it to someone else, or give it to someone else who needs it, that type of thing. Then our behavior changes in that regard. So I think it's a very powerful thing there that you say, Sandra, to say we shouldn't make people feel uncomfortable for the choices they make, because no one should be made to feel at fault for that.
That's very true, and I think it's really nice that you guys are you concur on just that, and that is a question I actually had for both of you, was how do we balance this responsibility on the individual to be aware of their water footprint, to be aware of their habits, and to empower them with that knowledge and make them aware. How do we balance that with also not necessarily suggesting that individuals are the only ones at fault, and that there isn't maybe that big companies and organizations and governments also should be held accountable? And I wonder how you guys have interacted with those two things with your work, from raising awareness on the individual, whilst also perhaps not wanting to ignore or belittle the more structural, like larger scale issues, which you, Sandra, touched upon when saying that, say, large scale farms received much better technology, so they could be more sustainable, which then in turn puts the onus on these small scale farms as if it's then their problem or their fault, which from the sound of both of you, we want to avoid that narrative. So how do we negotiate that? How do we make sure that we hold the right people accountable whilst remaining empowering?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's, you know, to me, it's an all hands on deck moment now. You know, we don't have a lot of time to roll out solutions. And the great thing about water is that everyone can participate, whether we're an individual, a community, a company, a business, you know, a state government, a local government, a federal government, the international community. Everyone has a role to play in achieving a more sustainable, harmonious balance of water use with nature. And I think it's understanding what our role is in our life. And we have just been talking about the individual can focus on their water footprint. The individual can get involved in, you know, community water issues, watershed protection, that kind of thing. But what's interesting to me too is what I have seen in my work is that the solutions are out there. You know, my last book, Replenish, to me was inspiring to research because I found all these solutions to fixing the broken water cycle, whether it's a farmer, a rancher, a city, a community, individuals. But we have to figure out how to scale them up, right? We have to give the incentives. We have to have the legal framework to scale these solutions up more quickly than they're scaling. And that's where I think we need to get the science and the policy bridged, and start to really incentivize these solutions. You know, you asked Georgette about, you know, what's changed over the years. And I think one of the things that it hasn't changed as much as it needs to, but is moving, is that we're less in a silo around water. You know, when I first came out of grad school, water was mostly an engineering enterprise. You know, it was dams and diversions and pipes and treatment plants, and that was all very, very helpful. It provided water to so much of the world and to agriculture and so on. And I think we see it in a much broader way now, that water is hiding in everything in our lives, which means that it's touching everyone, everything. And so we need these solutions that are more holistic, and that's a great thing, because virtually everyone in their life can be involved in some way. But this issue of scaling solutions that are working, you know, modifying them to the locale, to the geography, to the ecology, is critical. But then how do you scale it up? You know, I think about in agriculture, you know, the use of drip irrigation could be much wider. Soil health, my goodness, huge opportunities there. In the United States, where I am, maybe 6% of our cropland has cover crops to improve soil health and protect the soil from erosion, and to build that soil reservoir. Well, we could scale that up if we had the incentives in place to do that. So there's a lot of opportunity at all of these spheres, but it's bringing that practice and the science and the policy, you know, together to roll those solutions out more quickly.
Definitely. And I think that's maybe a great segue to ask you, Pontso, to talk a little bit about your project with Nosetsa. From what I've understood, it's been designed to be an add-on to existing technology, which was that the idea to make this add-on to existing irrigation technology? Did you have scale in mind? Was that a way of making it easier to apply? And so, yeah, if you could just tell us a little bit about that, because I think that's a great example of what Sandra's talking about here, bridging science and policy and innovation, starting from the ground up, from the fields that are being farmed.
So one of the things that we realized as the project was evolving was that there are already mechanisms to deploy water onto crop that are in use, depending on the size of the cultivation project. So if one is doing intense commercial agriculture, they'll have machinery that is connected to the water supply in some way, and it will extract water from a source and then deploy it to the crop. But what we did realize was that there's a possibility of incorporating the same idea of making the deployment of water autonomous at a machine level. And one of the things that we're realizing with this is that on the commercial aspect of it, one of the things that ends up becoming a barrier to entry, for example, as a startup, is the issue of at which stage is the idea developed, which dictates what kind of, for example, funding you would get to deploy the idea as rapidly as possible. And there are several hurdles that you have to cross there, but the biggest issue with investment ultimately comes from the issue of, to solve this on a very large scale would require a significant amount of investment. But the catch is, as with most startups, the stage of development of even the business of putting this into practice becomes the determining factor. And that, I think, is one of the things that come in the way of things like scaling innovations in a broad sense. However, I would like to say that it is possible to get some kind of assistance. For example, one of the things that has happened to the project Nosetsa so far is that it has received support from 2 state organizations here in South Africa. And one of those, the major impact of those support mechanisms is to help it get to a stage where it can be piloted. And that's a good thing, because once you have a pilot, then you have data that can back up a business case. And once that is then determined, you can have something that can be invested into either at angel or venture capital level. And at that stage, that's when a business starts to grow and solve a big problem, unlike it being just focused on pilot stage. So that's one of the things those are some of the things that I've come to notice with regard to this. And in terms of scale, as I said, one of the things we identified was that on, for example, one farm, you could have a specific way of deploying water, but if you can attach this kind of tool onto what already exists, then if you have multiple of those, you can then scale it in that manner. And a business case that makes sense to the person who will be investing in it to use it is another important factor there. And it's one of the things that can even lead to potential partnerships with, for example, equipment manufacturers of irrigation technology.
Right, yeah. So it's important to use what's already there and what's accessible. Because I mean, there has to be, for the most part, there has to be something in it for us. And I think that's whether it's the wider protection of water resources, or to help on like an individual basis, that it's not going to come at too high a cost, but can have those benefits. I think that's a really interesting aspect of your of the project.
And just to add on to that, Georgette, one of the things that are quite important to note, I saw a question in the comments there from one of the audience members, that should we put much responsibility on the end user of water, who is just an individual, to conserve water. And I think, like Sandra said, it's an all hands on deck thing. Big companies are aware of the significant water use that they have. That is why in some cases they would even support initiatives that help develop solutions to some of the challenges that they face to create a sustainable world. I don't think we should take it for granted that organizations are unaware. I think they are aware. They're run by people just like you and I, who are quite familiar with the impact that their work has on the environment and immediate communities. So when innovations like this speak to that kind of audience, then it triggers a sense of responsibility in them to say, okay, you know what, I'll try this out.
And I could just add on to that, Pontso's point is good to emphasize, that when you were introducing me, you mentioned the water stewardship initiative that I helped to create when I was at National Geographic, and it became known as Change the Course. And the whole attempt with that water stewardship initiative was to bring the general public, the business community, and the conservation community together, to do those two things that I was talking about: educate about our water footprint, shrink that water footprint, and return water to the natural world. And the business community more and more is stepping up to this challenge. And what we were proposing is not just to conserve and recycle within the factory, within the manufacturing facility. That's very important. Do whatever you can to use water more efficiently in producing whatever product you're making, a t-shirt, whatever. But then go beyond that and balance your footprint as a company by returning water to the natural world. And the way you can do that is by partnering with a conservation group that is doing on-the-ground restoration of a river, of a watershed, of a wetland. And so it's bringing those pieces together, and the businesses provide the funding that the conservation world may need. The public is engaged, and so companies are aware that their public relation value is going to increase because the public cares about a healthier natural world. So it kind of brought all those pieces together, and companies really seem to be many companies seem to want to be part of this solution. And so providing that framework, I think, is helping to roll out, some of these solutions. And it was it continues on. It's, to me, it was a very inspiring thing to watch grow, and continues to be a very inspiring thing to watch grow from the side.
Yeah, and I think that's what you say about businesses rising to the challenge and looking at our consumption. I think that's what's so interesting when looking at innovation within agriculture, because it's not as if making less food is necessarily an option. So it's like you say, looking at these balances and how we can look at restoration with production, or how, like with Pontso's innovation, effectivizing or making more efficient the water use in agriculture, because unfortunately it's not as black and white as we stop eating food.
No, and it's very important, that one thing that's also changed a lot in 30 years is companies much more now than before look at their whole supply chain. So if you're producing tomato sauce, if you're going to have a low water footprint for your tomato sauce, you can't just worry about the factory where the tomato sauce is made. You absolutely need to think about the farmers who are growing the tomatoes, and work throughout the supply chain to shrink that footprint. Just the way individuals can think about their diet and consume less of those products that take a lot of water to make. Throughout that whole chain, there are things that can be done. And so thinking more holistically, I think, has been a really, really important part of our evolution in this direction.
For sure. And I just wanted to, just because these are huge things we're talking about, huge changes that you've seen over your career, Sandro, and also Pontso. You've also been working with this for 15, 16 years now. And I just thinking about something you said in the beginning, Sandra, about that you were young when you started, and you feel like, or you mentioned that allowed you to think more broadly and maybe look at like the more holistic view of water, that you weren't an engineer specifically. And I wonder, what is the benefit, and I'm asking this now, as Ela mentioned, I'm the focal point for youth empowerment. And this is to both of you. Why do we need to empower youth? You both started pretty young in a pretty big field. So I was wondering if you had any spontaneous thoughts on that. And I know, Pontso, you recently won an award for like a young innovator. And I wonder if you maybe even feel, is being young an asset, like how Sandra was saying, it gives you a broader perspective and you are maybe more open to ideas, or does it feel like it's holding you back, that you're getting categorized as young? I'd love to know what you guys think about that.
I think it is important to empower youth, because we are ultimately the people who will inherit the earth as time progresses rather. And the important thing about that is that we have to be cognizant of the fact that there's a saying from one of native tribes, I think in North America, that says something along the effect of we borrow the future from we borrowed the earth from future generations, something to that effect. And one of the things that is important about that is, as a youth, at some point I will have, let's say, kids, and they will be the next generation. Already there are a lot of those. Africa is the youngest continent in the planet. And what that means is, whatever it is that those who are alive today have as an impact on the planet, it will stay with those that get to remain once the older ones get to leave the planet, get to leave the earth. And the important thing about that we should always keep in mind is, it puts us in a responsible position to say we have to actively shape then the discourse of the destiny of the planet. And like Sandra mentioned, if we can reduce the water footprint of making a food item, like let's say orange juice, then we can also look at making that same impact at cultivation phase. So that means the entire value chain is to be incorporated into that. And that's one of the things that the project, for example, is a member of the African Agri Council. And one of the things that is being advocated for in that organization is using ag tech that has a sustainable impact on crop production. And the important thing with that is that we're also seeing instances that have been reported of climate migration in certain parts of the continent. And that means that effectively as a young person experiencing that now, I'm forced to think of what that would mean for someone who's going to come after me. Secondly, I don't think that being young is a setback. I think it's a plus. I think that it is something I should take advantage of, because youth comes with energy. It may not come with a lot of wisdom, but it comes with energy. And that energy, if positively directed, can result in wonderful things. And we also live in a very technologically advanced time compared to most eras in all of humanity's history. And one of the things that presents us with is an opportunity to experiment with various ideas. But that also comes with a need now to financially back that appetite for the risk, which is kind of where there's still a setback. But because of that, I mean, the energy of youth coupled with the trends in tech, coupled with a need to solve problems, because a lot of young people are also waking up to the fact that, oh, okay, but I do have a footprint, so I need to do something. But what's out there? They have those questions. So if you can combine all of those in a nice pot and have a nice cocktail, I think that would be something good to swallow,
Yeah, I think what Pontso said is exactly right. I mean, I'm very inspired by the youth movement, particularly the climate movement. And we talked a little bit about guilt this morning. I mean, I have I wouldn't say guilt is the right word, but yeah, maybe it is. That my generation, our generation, didn't do enough, and of course, no generation does enough, but, we've known about the climate issue, since in a societal way, for 40 years. And it goes back beyond that. And yet we didn't take the action we needed to take. And there's some regret. There's some, I think, could I have done more as, someone who's speaking about it? You do what you can. But having said that, the youth, to me, are very inspiring. The fact that the youth movement is so powerful now, and they're so active, working for change. And I think there is that recognition. This is the earth we're going to move into as adults, and we need to get at it. And it's on every continent. It's global, and I think it's extremely inspiring. And I think to the extent that people in my generation can embolden the younger people to really move into this moment in a powerful way, we should do that. I'm not ready to pass the baton, but I'm totally ready to share the baton, because it's, as I say, it's an all hands on deck moment. What Pontsho is doing, incredibly important. We need, these technologies, we need solutions out there. And I think bringing the passion of youth and the inspiration of young people, the realization that if you're an engineer, if you're an ecologist, if you're an anthropologist, if you're a sociologist, if you're an economist, whatever, you have a place in water. Whatever your professional passion is, you can apply it to these critical solutions of climate and water and energy if you choose to. And I think it's great. And I'm very inspired by that. And I want to do what I can to help make that movement more successful.
That's great to hear from both of you. I think you've both got a lot more to give, like you say, Sandra. So no need to give over the baton soon. to everyone. But I think we're heading towards having time for a few audience questions. I have many more questions myself, but it was just too interesting talking to you and listening to you guys. So I'll just hand over to my colleague Elin to ask a couple of questions.
Yeah, it's been so great listening into your conversation, and we do have some questions. They are a little bit scattered, but I'll try to address them. There was Sandra, you were talking about the communication gap, and someone is wondering about the experience between science and policy, the communication gap. So, and there's also a question like, how do you actually bridge that one, especially for local government units, for national governments, and even remote communities? And especially during a pandemic, like how do we bridge that gap and maybe throw in practice there as well? Mm-hmm. And I think that's very much related to the role of institutions. And maybe Pontso, you can also address that from the South African perspective as well. Mm-hmm. So let's start with that question.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think it's a really good question. And, you know, I have to say the last couple of years, we've seen this erosion of truth that's been very, very alarming. You know, the idea that climate change has become, do you believe in climate change, as opposed to a scientific fact? And that's disconcerting. So I think one of the things we can do is, whether we're an individual, a business, you know, is to speak the truth, you know, and recognize that we have to get back to scientific truth. And of course, science doesn't know everything, of course not, but I think we've allowed belief to replace fact, and that's not helping us right now. I also think it helps a lot when scientists feel comfortable speaking out. You know, I think there's been a tendency in the scientific world, you know, to not engage as much in policy or public debate because they like to keep the science more pure and keep it in the scientific realm. And yet, you know, we need an educated public, and who better to educate than the scientists who are doing the work and finding these solutions. And so I think more active communication among the scientific world and the public and the policy world would make a difference. You know, I was fortunate to feel, as part of my mission in life, that communication was important to me. You know, I was really wanting to do the research, but I always wanted to write and I always wanted to communicate. And so it's been as important to me to write in public magazines and public, you know, areas where the public is likely to read something than just strictly the academic journals. I've done both. But I think, you know, having more engagement with the facts and what scientists are finding, and having that discourse enter our public sphere more would be really helpful to bridging this gap. So I'll just stop there and let Pontsho weigh in on that. It's an important question because we now have different segments of society believing different things that are not beliefs. You know, they're facts, and we can disagree about the solutions to take. We can disagree, but when scientists present findings as factual, we need to sort of work with that together as a society. And I think we've moved away from that. And that's a bit of a unfortunate and somewhat unsettling and scary thing to me.
You know, just to chip in there, thank you, Sandra, for highlighting the importance of bridging the gap between science and dialogue in terms of informing the public. I think one of the things that the pandemic has made us realize is that there's so much in terms of misinformation that can go around and spread to everyone. One of the things that I'm quite sure everyone in the audience has come across is, oh no, there's no COVID, it's a conspiracy, it's this, it's that. The greatest minds in the world with a lot of money are trying to sterilize us and reduce the population, that type of thing. Having heard all of those, I always find myself in conversations, even with people that maybe one relates to either on a familial basis or their friends or their colleagues, it doesn't matter. And you always, now, because you understand the science behind how viruses work, even if it's from your basic high school, but the fact that that's how it can work and spread gives you an idea, and you can verify that by reading an article because you are inclined to that kind of literature. You find that you have to explain that, look, okay, this is how virus works. This is what it does. And this is how it can spread. There's a mathematical way to model it. There is this, there is that. But the fact that for the most part, we've associated conviction with what is knowledge that is backed by fact is quite concerning. However, I really do think that when we become realistic about things, then the message shifts. So one of the things that I, using the COVID example, I got in a conversation with, I had to make someone aware that even if they believe that there's a conspiracy, it's fine. But they shouldn't insist on not wearing a mask, for example, just because they believe it's a conspiracy. The fact that people can lose their lives to this that they can't see is reason enough to put on a mask to protect yourself and your loved ones. And I think when the message is spread in that direction, it changes, and it changes how people respond and behave. Now, back to water, science, and policy. One of the things that I'm attempting to do with the video blogs that I mentioned earlier, it's really short videos, 20, 30, 40 seconds long. And I just introduce myself. Hi, I'm Mr. P. I'm here to talk to you about random water facts. And it turns out that the amount of water it takes to make one orange can amount to so many liters, and it's in the hundreds. And then, isn't it weird that carrots are more orange than oranges? That type of thing. So the idea is put a fact across, but then, juxtapose it against something that's quite humorous, that's relatable, someone even didn't think about. Like, I didn't realize that carrots are quite orange, more orange than oranges, until I actually looked at a number of carrots and compared them to the oranges that were at my disposal. Well, the ones behind me are still quite green, and I'm gonna harvest in a few months, but that's not the point. But the point is, I think that in my teens, because I used to debate for my school, and at some point in university I did it, has gotten me to this point where I'm now taking my scientific inclination and I'm trying to water it down and, excuse the pun, make it relatable enough that when spoken to just about anyone, it can make sense or it can inspire new knowledge. One of the things that great salesmen are said to have is to challenge people by teaching them something new. And I'm hoping to achieve that with that kind of work. And one of the things that I enjoy about it is that I get to get out of my comfort zone. And I think that's what the scientific community needs to step out of, which is something that I advocate for at a lot of the platforms that I go to. I'm always advising that we should try to talk the science without too much science. The fact that Carl Sagan mentioned that we live in a science and technology backed society, but hardly anyone understands the science and technology that runs the world is a problem in and of itself. But scientific community needs to step out of the comfort zone of being very nerdy and technical in the use of language and step into a very relatable. I understand that the purity of not misconstruing concepts is very important when articulating a scientific fact. But when you have to speak it to someone who doesn't have that inclination, it then becomes important to speak in a language that everybody can understand. If you remember, I don't know how many people have watched things like Science Park or Family Guy, but you get such abrasive forms of humor. There's one where I recall someone was being told, speak in the language we can understand, Mr. Scientist. And that in and of itself tells you just how the disconnect forms. It's kind of like how a politician would always speak political jargon to exclude certain people from participating in that sphere. I feel the scientific community, the STEM community in general, has had that going for a long time, where we are very focused on speaking about our science in a very sciencey way. And we forget that we want to communicate the science to people who are not sciencey. So how do we take out the too much science from the science to make that science make sense to people that are not sciencey? That is what I'm trying to accomplish. And I think that bridging that gap, stepping out of the comfort zone of being too technical, can help spreading the message of
what it means to interact with the world from a scientific basis.
Thanks so much. I think that that really answers the question. I like taking the science out of science to bridge the gap. But we do have some more questions, but I think that we actually need to start to round off. But I thank you so much. Feel free to go into the chat or Q&A box to answer as well. But I'll hand over again to Georgette to just have a few final words. Thanks.
Thank you first. Thank you both for joining us. We might have to make this a regular thing because I think this was a really fun discussion and I'd love to hear more. So maybe everyone can pencil this into their calendar as a regular dialogue.
Okay, I'm keen.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Pen.
Yeah. And thank you everyone who's been watching at home and for your questions. We'll try and answer them. We'll also do a little write-up of this tomorrow, which will be available on our website, where we'll try and answer any questions we didn't get to now. But for now, I'll say that innovation in an industry like agriculture that has existed since the beginning of time is no mean feat. But throughout your career, Pontso, you have shown that innovation is always possible. And Sandra, you've reflected that you've seen so much development in terms of individual behavior and consumption, as well as on individual, as well as national, maybe even international scales, which explains your guarded optimism. And all of this has been facilitated by empowering individuals and communities with knowledge and awareness of the scarcity of water so that we can bridge these gaps between science and policy, between the individual and the earth. And Sandra, you mentioned at the beginning that it was daunting starting one of your first jobs in a field as big as water on a global scale, but you did it anyway. And I think if there's one thing we can take away from today, is to find our niche, to find our passion, to marry the energy of youth and the wisdom that comes with experience, so that together we can just do it anyway, no matter how scary it feels. And then together we can work towards a water-wise world for everyone. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Thank you everyone at home. And our next water dialogue will be on the 26th of April. So I hope we see you there. And in the meantime, myself and Sandra and Pontso will maybe start a TV show or a YouTube channel or something so we can carry on this conversation. Thank you everybody and have an amazing afternoon.
Bye everybody.
Awesome. It was a pleasure and thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Georgette. Bye.
Bye everyone.